Hello, welcome everybody to another terrific AltaSea webinar. I'm very pleased to be your moderator today on Earth Day. This is the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. It started in 1970, and what a perfect way to recognize it. You know, I spent 30 years at KCT as a reporter, television journalist, news executive, and now I'm retired and I'm very interested in the environment, which is what one of the reasons why I got involved with AltaSea and why it's so exciting here. You know, AltaSea is an enterprise, as many of you probably know, located at the Port of Los Angeles, dedicated to accelerating scientific collaboration, advancing the blue economy through business innovation and job creation. And it also aims to inspire the next generation of young people who will become, we hope, ocean lovers and will help develop solutions to the many challenges that are facing our oceans. And of course, we all know life on the land depends on the ocean. Even though we are terrestrial beings, our life depends very much on what is happening in our oceans and seas. So I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, and thank you so much for being here. So the way you ask your question is put them in the chat box, and then Jacob, our wonderful producer, will text them to me. And I really like to get to your questions as soon as possible, so don't hesitate to ask, and I hope that we get to all of them. And now let me introduce our three accomplished panelists. With us is Meredith Brooks. Meredith is the Strategic Grants and Special Projects Consulting Manager at AltaSea at the Port of Los Angeles. She is expanding the AltaSea Marine Grants program to include government grants with a focus on STEM education, aquaculture, and growing the blue economy in LA. She has 15 years of management and communications experience in sustainable aquaculture, R&D, and conservation. She is also the author of 2 K-12 STEM curriculums for Hawai'i schools. Meredith graduated from USC with a BA in political science and journalism. Welcome, Meredith. Also with us is Bruce Heyman. He's executive director of the Los Angeles Maritime Institute, which has been involved with the Tall Ships program in the harbor for many years. Los Angeles Maritime Institute is a nonprofit that uses and gives middle and high school students in San Pedro and Wilmington and throughout Los Angeles County hands-on experiences at sea. And I've seen them myself, and they are fabulous. The kids are thrilled. Also with us, Dr. Julianne Passarelli. She is a marine biologist specializing in parasitology and ecology of marine fishes. Dr. Passarelli is the education and collections curator at the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium in San Pedro, right here in California. She is also a lecturer at Cal State University Long Beach and a research associate at the Natural History Museum of LA County. She received her PhD in biology from UCLA, a master's degree in biology from California State University Long Beach, and a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from Cal State Long Beach. So thank you, all of you, for being here. We have a fascinating topic, marine protected areas, MPAs, but you're going to tell us more about how they work, what they do, how important they are, how they're controlled, the whole thing. It's a fascinating topic, and it's very, very rich. So we will begin now with the first question, which I will ask of Dr. Passarelli. First of all, give us an overview, if you can, of the marine protected areas. And we're going to just call them MPAs. So everybody remember when we say MPAs, we mean marine protected areas. So how much of the planet is presently designated, or are the oceans presently designated MPAs? Give us kind of an overview. What are they, and how big are they? And are there 2 of them, or are there 2,000 of them? What's the briefing? Quick briefing here.
Right. Thanks, Paul. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and happy Earth Day to everybody. Yeah, so when we say MPAs, everyone realizes we're talking about marine protected areas. And they're basically, it's a designated area of the coastline. Sometimes it can go into estuaries, sometimes it can go relatively deep, but it's a discrete defined area that's typically managed and protected by some kind of governmental agency. And I like to say they're like national parks on land. And sometimes we even refer to them as underwater parks. But the main purpose is for protecting marine life and habitat. And there's, as far as globally, there's thousands of them around the world, and probably the one of the largest and probably one of the most famous is the Great Barrier Reef in northeastern Australia. That's a huge marine protected area. And you know, although what's interesting though is our ocean covers about 70% of our planet, less than 10% of it is protected by marine protected areas. So we have a ways to go protecting our habitats and our ecosystems globally. But in California, we have 124 marine protected areas. And a legislature was passed in 1999 in the state of California. And it was the Marine Life Protection Act was voted in, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, then called GAME, California Fish and Game, it was their job to designate or redesignate our existing marine protected areas. And they broke the state down into 5 different regions. And over the years after 1999, they designated these 124 throughout our state along our coastline. And if we go closer to Southern California, because that's where we are, Southern California has 50 marine protected areas, which is about 15% of our coastline. And we have 2 special closure areas. And all of this went into effect on January 1st, 2012. And then if we go even narrower to Los Angeles County, we have 4. And they're all along the Palos Verdes Peninsula. There's 2 on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and then there's 2 up by Malibu. And they're all regulated and organized and controlled and managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Got it. Boy, and there's so much more you could get into, because I know there's all different designations, which we'll get a little bit into the weeds here because it is fascinating. But Bruce, in the meantime, if you have a different perspective on MPAs, right? You're a mariner. What does it mean? And here's the other question I have: how can you tell whether you're in or out of one or about to cross one? It's I never understood that. You can't stick up a sign, you know. Oops, hold on, you're muted. Unmute
there
yourself.
I go. I'm the famous saying from 2020, right? Oh, you're muted. Thank you, Val. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, AltaSea, for producing this, and I'm awesome to be on with these 2 experts. Yeah, mariners, you know, maybe have a slightly different perspective on it, but I think as a professional mariner, you know, we spend most of our time at sea, so we love the sea and we want it to be healthy. You know, and I just want to give you an example. We do most of our operation here at Los Angeles Maritime Institute out of the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. And if we go back about 100 years or more, you know, the fishing industry just exploded in our port. At the peak, I think we were pulling 185 million pounds of fish. I might be off a little bit on that per year. And we had, I believe, 40 canneries. And then probably on the order of 5,000 mariners or workers that service that industry. And I think that, you know, the lack of MPAs back then is why they're so important, that we ended up overfishing and destroying some of the environment that allowed it to be healthy. So, you know, I remember the contentious activities and hearings that led up to the 2012 MLPA law. I'm very glad that it went through, and I think we can already see the results, and we'll talk some more about that, I'm sure, later on. But I think a lot of the environments are coming back. How do you tell where you are? It's kind of interesting, you know, there's all sorts of different limits out in the ocean. There's the 200 mile, the 1200 mile, the 3 mile, 6 mile. It all depends, you know, whether it's a state, local, federal. You really, it's not like there's a line in the water or a road sign as you're sailing around. So there's a whole bunch of tools that as professional mariners we use, whether they're NOAA produced navigational charts, or NOAA produces a lot of information on the marine protection areas as well. So the mariner has to know where they are on different charts and different documents so they know where they are.
Got it. And we'll get more into that, of course, because it's fascinating as a mariner. You know, how is it policed and so forth. We'll get into that. In the meantime, Meredith, tell us a little bit more about aquaculture, because many in the aquaculture community see MPAs as areas that are off limits to farming. Is that right? And what is the relationship there? And maybe just in case, we should explain real quickly what aquaculture is.
Sure, no problem. And thank you, Val. And thank you to my fellow panelists for having us today and for moderating this wonderful panel. So first, a little bit about aquaculture is the aquatic farming of either fish or other aquatic species and also aquatic plants. And when you think of aquaculture and MPAs, a lot of people don't think about them together, but there's actually a lot of opportunity within MPAs for sustainable aquaculture and specifically restorative aquaculture, which is the aquaculture of plants and animals that are actually beneficial to the environment and can help with the goals of the MPA and have synchronistic activities within those goals. So we'll get into that a little bit more too, but for definition purposes, the International Union for Conservation of Nature has 6 categories of MPAs, and the last 2 categories, category 5 and 6, do allow for aquaculture, and there are several case studies across the world where the symbiotic use of aquaculture in MPAs has increased the positive impacts of those MPAs.
And is aquaculture both non-commercial and commercial, or is it
Yes,
different?
there's all different forms of aquaculture, from the smallest scale backyard even to community-based aquaculture, which is what you see in MPAs, especially in the Pacific Ocean. A lot of the work in communities is done in unison with the conservation managers. And then there's also commercial, larger scale commercial, so small, medium, and large scale commercial operations.
Got it. And back to Julianne, Dr. Passarelli, how are MPAs used as a tool to improve the marine resource management, and how well do they work? Do they work quickly? Does it take years? You know, it is a tool basically to preserve and nourish the oceans that are in trouble. How do they do that, and how well do they work?
That's right. So it's also it's really important to know that the areas that are designated aren't just randomly chosen. It's based on years and years of data and scientific monitoring and a lot of collaboration between many different groups to decide what's the best area to designate. And sometimes they're small, and sometimes they're really big, and sometimes there's a network of them. And it just depends on what habitat and what species are there and what's happening there. And so, you know, sometimes if a group of fish have a specific spawning location and they all gather at a certain time of year, then scientists will suggest, let's protect this area and there's no fishing allowed in that area, or certain gear can't be used because that species is absolutely vulnerable at that time. And then they'll also work in a network, so that as you protect a certain region of coastline, the idea is that if there's no fishing allowed or no take allowed in that area, that there could be a spillover effect, and that, you know, a lot of the animals, at least that are highly prized for fishing, are mobile, they're fish. And so the idea is that as you protect a certain area and let fish get to a certain size, if they move around, they will move out, and then they'll be protected to a certain size. But it is also important to know that marine protected areas are not the only source of management. They're an additional tool. And at least in California, there's bag limits, catch limits, size limits, season restrictions, and those complement the marine protected areas, and they're monitored for years. And like I said, there's a lot of collaboration with the state biologists and with researchers and the public, and a lot of other agencies that are really all they want to do is to protect our resources for future generations.
When they put fishing limits, is that done, does that apply to the entire ocean or only to the section of the ocean over which a particular government or jurisdiction has control? In other words, are there parts of the ocean that are completely unregulated when it comes to fishing?
Sure.
And only, and you know, I think Bruce mentioned we have these, you know, the 3 mile, the 10 mile, and so we're really talking about a relatively small portion of the ocean that fishing is limited, and a huge part of it is still a free-for-all.
Sure. Yeah. And it
Wow.
depends state by state, right? So along the coastline, usually about 3 nautical miles out, right, Bruce, is state waters. And so that's regulated by each state. It varies state by state. I believe Texas and Florida a little bit further out. But then beyond that is federal waters. And then beyond that, yeah, it's just kind of
Wow.
But yeah, and the United States, especially our coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, we're one of the best of the states as far as marine protected areas, and Hawaii has some as well, but it's not the entire state, right? As I mentioned, there's 124 in California and 50 in Southern California. And like I said, some of them are big, some of them are small, but they're typically designated by some kind of geographical point on land. So usually it's like, you know, like Point Doom to this point. And then it's always up to the mean high tide line. And then it's usually 3 nautical miles out, which is state waters. Estuaries are different because those go in, but it still has a high tide. And there's maps, there's latitude and longitude definitions of every marine protected area. For California, just go onto California Department of Fish and Wildlife's website, which I believe is wildlife.ca.gov. And they have a map of California, they have a map of Southern California, every region. And if you plan to go fishing in a certain area, it's up to you to make sure you're not in an MPA and where you are, and making sure you're following the rules and the guidelines that are imposed by the state.
Wow. You know, I want to mention, if we have young people watching and they're interested in aspects of oceanography or whatever, just what you said reminds me of how many different professions, areas of expertise, everything from government policy to, you know, mapping to the job possibilities are just endless when it comes to oceanography. A lot of people think, well, you have to be a scuba diver. Not true. You can be involved with protecting our oceans in so many different ways. Mapping, legal stuff, it's incredible. So I hope that young people who are thinking of getting involved in this, you can do a whole lot from land to protect our oceans, and of just managing these MPAs. It can be pretty mind-boggling. But I want to go to Bruce now. Bruce, as mariners, you know, people who just love to be out on their boats and with young people or whatever, how are you made aware of the MPAs, and, you know, how do you learn about them? Is there a briefing? Is there, you know, do you have to, like, a driver's test? Do you have to kind of, how do you know?
Val, a great question. But if you're okay, I'd like to go back to the previous one in terms when you were reaching out to all the youth. You know, some of the best ways to protect our oceans are from the land side. You know, I think everybody has to remember everything that goes into a storm drain ends up down here in the water. So everything you can do in the watershed and the uplands to protect it helps everything we're doing down here. And believe me, some of the stuff that makes it into the water can definitely harm the animals the very animals that we're trying to protect. So, you know, that's an important part that we impart on all of the students, and we do about 7,000 students a year on the tall ships. We try to make sure they understand what they and their families can do with the watershed to protect it. So you know, you ask a great question, Val. You know, I had to go through a lot of training and testing to get my captain's license. You know, it's issued by the United States Coast Guard, and it's a very rigorous process.
So you're actually Captain Bruce?
I am a captain, yes. Not a military captain, a maritime captain. And, marine protection areas are just one element. There's a whole bunch of other things. There's even areas that the Navy has control of, and they don't want you straying into those areas. There's other areas that are, active with port activity that you should be staying out of and only transit through. So there's a whole bunch of things that professional mariners learn as they advance, from a deckhand to a first mate to a licensed captain. And then as captains go, there's different tiers of captains. NOAA provides nautical charts, and nautical charts are like the Thomas Guide or the road maps that we would use. But they're very important because, as Julie pointed out, the MPAs are marked by latitude and longitude, which we use constantly in our daily work. But they also would involve, like, Point Doom, I think was the example you used, Julie, right? Well, when you're on a boat and you're looking at the coast, there aren't any billboards that says Point Doom here, right? You need to be able to figure out where you are on a nautical chart and be able to tell which one is Point Doom. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of practice and experience to figure that out. And then to be able to follow the lat long and go the 3 miles out or whatever distance it is to figure it out. So
Do you guys have the equivalent of Google Maps?
Well, so
Digitally?
traditionally for professional mariners, we've always relied on paper. That has been, the standard, and we actually draw on them, and they're erasable. And what that is because it's important for life safety, right? If the electronics fail, if the batteries fail, you don't want to just go, "Hey, Coast Guard, can you come help me? Where are you?" "Well, I'm a white boat out in the ocean." Right? There's about 5,000 white boats out in the ocean, and it's a big place. So having nautical charts allows you to keep track. Because electronics are getting so reliable, the Coast Guard is starting to relax that, and it's probably not many years from now that nautical charts will go away. But the nautical charts take a lot of time, and we try to teach students and give them exposure. They're so rich in information. All the things that Julie was talking about are often on there, and important information. The most important information when you navigate a ship is to make sure you don't run aground.
That's true.
Right?
You and I, we're probably one of the few people that know what the Thomas brothers are. But
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. I believe I just dated myself. I apologize.
Yeah, here too. I know we lived and died by the Thomas brothers when we were driving around covering news stories.
Yes, exactly.
So funny. It's basically a huge paper map in a book form. But anyway, Meredith, could you elaborate a little bit on aquaculture and MPAs? Some people think, aquaculture is polluting and damaging, and how can that possibly work with MPAs? Elaborate on the relationship between those two.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first thing is to probably address why that belief is held among naturalists and conservationists and some MPA managers. Really comes from unsustainable practices largely elsewhere in the world. The clearing of mangrove forests for shrimp farms and other farms, and other destructive practices like that have really left a bad taste. And any, escaping from net pens with finfish farms, any kind of cross-contamination, things like that are real problems. But there is a solution, and that is doing responsible aquaculture. There's right ways to do aquaculture, and there's something called best aquaculture practices that have been shared across the world and are being integrated into coastal management. Any farms that are along coasts, to first of all address those issues, but also to show the MPA managers and other natural resource managers that aquaculture can be used to help in the conservation and restoration of specific species. There's a lot of different examples of this across the world where it has worked in conjunction with restorative aquaculture. And I think another key thing to point out that Dr. Passarelli talked about is the regulations here in the United States. we do have pretty strict regulations, and permitting is not something that's done very easily. Anybody who's on this webinar who knows about aquaculture knows it's not easy to get an aquaculture permit here in the United States. And that's with good reason, because it does need to be done in a certain way under best aquaculture practices. And so I'll give some examples too of some of the successful, programs that we've seen across the world. In Italy, they helped to restore a species of grouper, and it brought large amounts of the fish and other fish species back into the area where they did restocking efforts with the grouper. So you have restoration coming from a point of growing new species such as bivalves and seaweeds that help to clean up the environment. And then you can also work on restoring species that have been depleted. So I believe it was Bruce was talking about overfishing, the overfishing that's happened throughout the oceans. And Dr. Passarelli talked about how basically you didn't use this term, but I will. It's like the Wild West out there in terms of pirate fishing, and it's a real problem. And there are wild populations of species that have been and continue to be on the brink of collapse. And restorative aquaculture and working on restocking specifically for that is one way to address that. So I think as more of that happens and more of the responsible aquaculture practices take over, we're seeing less and less hesitation towards it. And later on, I'll go into another example of Palau, but I think Palau is a great example of a country that is at the forefront of marine conservation, and they're working hand in hand with aquaculture.
Great, yeah, we will definitely get to that. Dr. Passarelli, did you want to elaborate on that? Because this is a very important issue, the commercial needs, aquaculture, the pressure, just by world population, which unfortunately keeps growing, commercial fishery. I mean, this is so important because what the commercial fishing industry does could really either devastate or, we hope, help restore our fisheries. So how do the MPAs and work with that, the commercial needs?
Well, what I will say is it's a really complex issue that has biological questions and political questions and social aspects all need to be considered. And as a biologist, I'll say that management of an ecosystem or a habitat varies depending on what different animals are living there and what species you're trying to protect or rehabilitate or conserve. And I'll give the example. I mean, I love to talk about fish, and that's a good topic for today. But fish reproduce really differently than say humans. Humans, we become reproductively mature pretty early on in our lives, and the older you get, the less likely you can reproduce, right? Once you hit about 35, 40, that's you probably can't reproduce. But fish are different. Fish, as they get older and as they get bigger, they produce more young. And so the really large fish are the ones that are producing the most offspring. And unfortunately, those are the prized ones, right? Those are the ones that people go after. And the other thing to think about is that some species of fish takes them a while to actually become reproductive. So sharks, for example, are a very good example of that. Like I'll give you an example, the great white shark. They live to be 70 years old or so, but they don't become reproductive until they're in their 20s or 30s. So if you're catching a fish before it can even reproduce, how can it replace itself in the population? And especially something like sharks that don't have very many young, they're similar to humans in that sense. It's really important to know the reproductive strategy of that individual. And another example are rockfish. Rockfish produce lots and lots of young, but not until way later in life. And so some rockfish can live over 100 years, but they won't become reproductive until way later in life. And if you're catching them before they've even had a chance to reproduce, it's not too difficult to think about what's going to happen to the population of that particular species. It's going to crash very quickly. And a good rule of thumb that I always tell my students or tell anybody that wants to listen about recovery of animals, short-lived, fast-growing species that tend to mature early, they recover quickly from heavy fishing. But fish that are long-lived, slow-growing, late-maturing species, they are very slow to recover. And those are things like sharks, rockfish, giant sea bass, all species that we know are having problems because they've been overfished.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And I love the way you explain it and you can relate it to people because now we get it, right? You're very good at explaining it. Bruce, what are the most important considerations when you map a sailing route? So you want to get from A to B, C, D, or E. How do you begin?
By the way, I just want to comment that I'm really glad that I'm not gonna be having children in my 60s. I'm glad that's over with by now. So how do we get from point A to B? That's very important. And that's what we use the nautical charts for. And that's what we use the latitude and longitude. And so that we can actually plot where our location is, we can plot where it is we're trying to get to. And then the reason it's important is you can't sail through land. You can't sail through rocks, right? You have to be very careful as you lay out your chart. And there's also aids to navigation. There are buoys or marks that are in the water, especially if you go outside of Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach, you're going to find that the area's got a lot of different marks that help us with navigation. So, but then you also have to take into account what's the tide doing. Fundamentally, our water that we have here in Southern California comes to us from up the coast in Alaska. It's just slowly moving its down in a big gyre in the Pacific. So you have to take into account what the water's doing, because remember, the boat sails in the water, not on the land. So you're moving the boat relative to the water, and you got to figure out what the water is doing. And then we also have to take into account what the wind is doing and how it's affecting the boat. So you do all of that math and analysis and chart, and that's how you figure out how to get from point A to B. And you may not be heading to B, you may be heading to C, but if you did your math right on the tide and the current and the wind, you'll end up at B, or at least pretty close to it.
Mm-hmm. Are there some areas that are simply off limits? For example, I was lucky enough to do a Galapagos tour, and which is a reserve. It's strictly off limits, although unfortunately it's very, very hard to police. The Ecuadorian government has some resources, but not enough. But nevertheless, like, would that be like, you would not be able to just to sail in there, right? You couldn't.
No.
Without all sorts of permits.
So thankfully we're in a position where we never ever violate it. So I don't know what the enforcement's like. And we do have a number of things that we've modified the vessels for that actually makes it easier for us to go around. As Julie, I think it was, that mentioned, there are 2 keep out areas. So there's areas where we're not allowed to transit, we're not allowed to go in there, we're not allowed to drop the hook, we're not allowed to send the kids in kayaks through it. There's no human involvement whatsoever, other than research, I think, is licensed individuals can go in. But for the most part, for us, there are 6 different levels of MPAs that we have to pay attention to, and there's different levels of what we can do. And for the most part, we go to areas where we are allowed to anchor. We never fish, or very rarely fish. And if we fish, it's going to be in the wide open ocean, just for the kids to have some fun.
Do you snorkel?
Yes, we snorkel, and it's actually very, very beneficial to be able to snorkel in or around the MPAs, because we're much more likely to find creatures. And I'll tell you, there's one other thing that we do. So, we typically are dropping the anchor somewhere over at Catalina Island. And at night, we will typically put a very bright light on the side of the boat that shines down on the surface of the water. And what that does is it just causes so many different animals to come to the surface, which then allows the youth to beget a real appreciation for how vibrant the ocean is and how many different types of animals there are in there.
Yes, yes.
So
I remember the Galapagos tour was amazing at night.
oh,
It was a shock, and they would come right up to the boat. I guess, I don't know, looking for food. It was one of the most fun parts of the day.
yes, I will say the one thing that we've modified our boats. So many of the MPAs areas, you want to be very environmentally sensitive. And if you think about 38 people living on a boat, there's a lot of water. There's shower water, there's, drinking water, hand washing water, other water that I won't talk about. And we have tanks on board that we hold so that we're able to keep all of that, so that we have zero discharge when we're in those areas, and that we're not likely to disturb the environment.
Oh, that is great, and we'll get more into that. Meredith, what are some examples of current interactions between aquaculture and the MPAs? Are there some really good examples of cooperation and things working out?
There are.
Maybe not working out?
Yeah, there are. I had mentioned the one about the groupers in Italy, and that was in an attempt to restore a population that had been completely depleted, down by 88% in a 10-year time frame, and it actually restored that population successfully. There's a lot of examples in the Pacific, especially related, as I mentioned earlier, to community farming. In Palau, they're working on restoring populations of mangrove crab, and giant clam. And they're doing restocking in MPAs, and they're also doing land-based hatcheries so that the local population and the markets that the two fisheries supply don't need to rely entirely on wild caught. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Palau has one of the largest, if not the largest, preserved area, with 78% of its EEZ is actually an MPA. And so the other 20% is still under management, but there's more activities allowed. And so there are activities that take place outside of the MPAs there, and then also some restocking within. Another great example that I wanted to bring up is in Costa Rica. I know this has taken place elsewhere too, but they've done studies on this particular project where they had seaweed plots planted in an MPA, and it actually significantly enhanced the biodiversity of the MPA. So I know Julie was talking earlier about choosing areas. When an MPA is selected, it's chosen based on where animals maybe will aggregate to spawn, and where they have the best likelihood of being in a nursery through their adult life. And so some of these aquaculture activities, especially with IMTA, which is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, so that's growing bivalves and seaweed together, maybe on long lines or in some type of a cage system out at sea or in a specific habitat, that growing that will actually provide habitat for animals and like a nursery for little baby fish. And it will also help to clean up the waters in a specific area. So it's useful in MPAs, and it's also useful in really dirtier waters where there needs to be more effluent management, which can be helpful at the outset of places that are leading into MPAs. So like river mouths, areas that are in direct proximity to MPAs, but might not be the actual MPA itself, but it does have that beneficial ecosystem effect on the area as well. And there's a lot more. I could go on for a long time. Those are some ones that I wanted to point out.
Well, that's great. We also have come to appreciate the complexity and the richness of these. And sometimes, you hear about the depletion of things, but then it's shocking at how quickly things come back under the right circumstances. And that's the really heartening, whether it be wetlands or perhaps, MPAs, things just restore themselves if you give them a chance.
Yeah, definitely. And if you don't mind too, on that note, I think it's important not just for aquaculture and not just for MPAs, but for all of the resource management to work together, including fisheries, and to have sustainable fisheries, because I don't think we're going to get to a place where people are just going to stop eating fish. And if we are, it's not going to be overnight. So it's about really working together and integrating the management to make sure that we have these sustainable resources for generations to come.
That's wonderful. Let's see, Dr. Pasquarelli, how do they measure the effectiveness of MPAs? Do you have like specific goals that you measured, you know, that success is measured against, or is just establishing an MPA, you know, successful in itself? How do you say this has really worked, or it needs to be expanded, or maybe it doesn't need to be so big anymore? How does that work?
So I'll just say data, lots of research. It's of course very helpful if has been monitoring and there's at least like a baseline before the MPA was implemented, so that you can see change over time, and that's a really useful way to see the change of a particular area. But that's not always the case. We don't always have a baseline population or diversity of species for a particular area. But one other way is to gather information, even from not just scientists, from recreational fisheries and any kind of catch. We can see if we have a consistent number of data points, then we can see that if there's a change over time. And if you're starting to catch larger fish outside of an MPA than you were 5 years before that, then it's very likely that the fish inside the MPA have grown and then are leaving the MPA, and then you're catching them. Again, that's kind of the spillover effect that I was mentioning earlier. But there's lots of published papers on how MPAs are doing and how they're being monitored. But I would say it's a huge collaboration with state agencies. For California's Department of Fish and Wildlife, and academics and public institutions. At the aquarium, we do a lot of monitoring along the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and we're one of the lucky ones that we've been monitoring the intertidal on the Palos Verdes Peninsula way before my time, since 1975. So we have an idea of what rocky intertidal organisms were living in that area every year since 1975. And 2 of our 3 sites are now marine protected areas. So we have a really good idea of what was there before the MPA, and now we can see what's happening after. So that's a good example. And we were lucky enough that our former director and her husband, who's a retired professor from Cal State Long Beach, they started this monitoring program in 1975. And then when I got hired in 2007, I took it over when they retired. So that's Dr. Suzanne Lawrence Miller and Dr. Alan Miller's work that I've continued on with lots of help.
I'm going to go to Bruce, and then I do have a question from one of our viewers. But Bruce, how you mentioned it a little bit, getting the kids out at sea and letting them snorkel. But how are other ways that sailing can connect young people to what's under the surface of the ocean, which is, again, just so unfortunately not a part of the majority of human beings' experience. It's a shame because we watch documentaries and we go, oh my gosh, look what's under there. But how many of us have even, put on a mask?
Well, I think it's human nature to fall in love with what you know, right? And when you get to experience it and see it, you say, I want to protect that. So, I would say as we're leaving, let's say we're leaving for a 5-day voyage with the youth to go over to Catalina, or
5 days.
Better if we can go to the Santa Barbara Island. The first thing they're probably going to see is they're going to probably see some pinnipeds hanging out on a buoy or 2 on the way out,
and
just sunning themselves.
What are pinnipeds?
Oh, let's get our resident Julie to answer.
That's a great
what a
word.
pinniped is.
Seals and sea lions.
So together they're under the pinniped Okay, got it. Very good.
Yep. Yep. So the other thing is just as you're going across, we, you can see that there's great pods, if I'm using the right term, I hope, for dolphin, right? So it's not uncommon because of the physics of a boat moving through the water, especially ours are a displacement hull. They have a huge bow wave in front of them. Sorry, I'm an engineer, so I get wonky every once in a while. But that bow wave is actually like an amusement park ride for dolphins. And then we have a bowsprit on the front of the boat, which is all part of the structure to keep the masts and the sails and connect the horsepower of the wind to the boat. Well, the youth can go out on those out on the bowsprit, and they can literally look straight down on the animals as they're swimming around, as the dolphins are playing in that bow wave. And normally, because of, again, physics, the angle of incident, when you look at the water, you can't see below the water. You're seeing it reflected off. But when you look straight down, you can see it. So you may even get, as they're breathing, you may get some of the spray on you. So it really gives you a very cool feeling for these animals and how cool they are. And usually when we're sailing out in the ocean and there's a pod anywhere near us, there'll be a bunch of dolphins that'll come running over to play.
Oh, it is. It's just, I hope all of us have had the chance to see it. It's unforgettable to see the dolphins all around you. It really, really is.
Well,
we have a question. Oh, go ahead.
If I have just a few more minutes,
yeah, go right ahead.
When we have enough time, I love to bring the youth over to the island of Santa Barbara Island, because Santa Barbara Island is another 20 nautical miles further on from Catalina, and it's well past the light pollution from our greater Los Angeles area.
Oh.
And so one of the things about being a safe mariner is you have to do anchor watch in the middle of the night. So it might be 2 a.m. in the morning, and our crew or one of the youth have to get up too. And you'll spend a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour on deck doing anchor watch. And while you're doing that, the stars are going to be bigger than life. But if anybody's been to the island of Santa Barbara, the marine life, the bird life, the pinniped life is just unbelievable. And it's all very visible, right? Because usually there's not a lot of turbidity, which is, the scientists will say better things than I will, but it's a measure of how murky the water is and how well you can see through it. And so the typical thing at night is you may see a cloud of green glow moving through the water, and that's a school of fish swimming, firing off the bioluminescence, which Julie or Meredith can explain better than I can. But then every once in a while, you'll see what looks like a torpedo going through that school of fish. And I'm pretty sure that's a predator having dinner. So, that's just some of the way, Val, that we can introduce the kids to the water and the vastness of the richnesses in the ocean, and hopefully appreciate it in the future.
Oh yeah, it's if you're lucky enough to have those experiences, they are really unforgettable. This question from Julian. I'm not sure I understand part of it. There is a clear lake of enforcement. I think maybe it's a typo. He talks about what international common frame, I think maybe it means framework, could we implement, like your example of the Galapagos, that would help, protect marine life. He says the Galapagos are facing increasing Chinese illegal intense fishing activities. Who should initiate such a thing? I do remember reading an article about, maybe it was more than a year ago, how about the Chinese were sending a huge flotilla of fishing boats toward the Galapagos. It was really scary. I don't know how close they got. But I think he's really asking about enforcement here, with the pressure from, unfortunately, governments that don't have, and commercial enterprises don't have the same appreciation for the environment, marine environment. I think it's kind of what he's saying. How can we better enforce this? Anyone want to take that?
Sure. I'll just mention the categories that I was talking about and that I'm pretty sure Bruce was talking about are from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And so they do have some regulation, but in reality, the regulation comes down to each country and their EEZ to regulate their own EEZ. But the IUCN is a body that does work on that collective conservation, I'll say. And then if anybody else wants to add anything else.
Yeah. If not, I also have a question from Ned. What type of interventions can be performed in an MPA? An example could, for example, could an overload of natural creatures, i.e. sea urchins, be removed? So what type of interventions can be performed in MPA? Could an overload, I don't know if it means oversupply of natural creatures, i.e. sea urchins, be removed from an MPA?
I'll take that one. I'll add on to what Meredith mentioned about the IUCN. There's also a group called CITES, CITES. It's the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species. And a lot of species that are endangered are protected under this. And it's how we regulate, whether it's for animals and plants, and how we regulate not bringing endangered species across borders. But to address the next question about removing an overabundance of a particular species, I think the example is urchins. Well, I'll say there still is. There's purple sea urchins along our coast in Southern California that the numbers in recent history have exploded, and they're really high. And that's for many reasons, but for I'll just give a few examples. One is the overtake or the removal of the black abalone in the intertidal. With the loss of that species, the purple urchin, they kind of take the same niche. They feed on very similar things, and they live in the same area. And we see that in our data. With the crash of the black abalone, you have the increase of the purple sea urchin. And another reason purple sea urchins subtidally, so lower in the deeper in the water, there's lots of species of fish that eat purple sea urchins. And if you, like California sheephead, if you overfish them, then the predator's gone. And so the basically the pressure for habitat or competition or being eaten is gone. A species can explode and the numbers can go really high. Well, why does that matter? Well, purple sea urchins, I didn't mention this, are herbivores. They feed on seaweed. And if you have too many purple sea urchins carpeting the bottom of a rocky reef, they're just going to mow right across and eat our most prized seaweed in Southern California, the giant kelp. Giant kelp can grow to 80 feet and grows 3 feet a day, and it makes these magnificent forests along our coast. And we are very lucky that we have giant kelp forest habitat along our coast. It's one of the most beautiful habitats, in my opinion, in the world. And when you have these big kelp forests, that attracts lots of animals. If you have kelp, then you'll have invertebrates, and then you'll have fish, and then you have sharks, and you have bigger fish, and it becomes a huge, huge, huge ecosystem. But if the purple urchins are all along the bottom, and you have this seaweed stipe coming up, and the purple urchin just grazes right across it and breaks it off, then that 80-foot stalk of that kelp will just drift away and wash up onto the beach and die. And that's a problem. And so there are agencies that go in and translocate or remove the purple sea urchins so that our kelp forests have come back, but it's absolutely regulated. It's people can't just go in and start removing animals, right? It's regulated, it's monitored, there's permits involved, and lots of research needs to be done before and after that happens.
That's a big job. I know we did stories on removing them. It is an enormous job, and scuba divers work just tirelessly to make that happen. Is there such a thing as planting of the giant kelp, or will it just come back on its own?
I'll let Meredith tell that one.
There is planting.
Can you create a forest? That's
yeah, you read my mind. Thank you so much for that description too, Julie, because that was really I think that provided a really thorough description and background of a serious problem that we're experiencing. And so one of the solutions to mitigating that problem is actually aquaculture and restoration of giant kelp. And that's something that AltaSea has gotten involved in a lot more over recent years with our research partners up and down the California coast, primarily at USC. We're working on kelp phenotyping, and it's probably a little bit too much detail for the 5 minutes that we have left, but there are a lot of activities that are taking place to not only replant kelp and create new kelp forest habitat, but to also look at the different species of kelp and find the ones that will be able to withstand the changing ocean acidification and eutrophication, basically some of the challenges that we're experiencing as a result of climate change in the ocean. So there is replanting of giant kelp, and then there's also additional work being done to find the strains of giant kelp that are the strongest to withstand the problems from the changing climate.
Oh, wow. Wow. I'm so glad you guys, really smart people, are in this area, not me. We have a few minutes left, so I'd love to have everybody have a chance for a final thought or a final message, anything they'd like to say as we close out this webinar, which could go on even longer. I'll begin with Bruce and Julianne.
Sorry, the audio went just out, just as you said. I'll start with, I assume you said yes. Start with me? Okay,
yes,
great.
Please, go right ahead.
Great. Well, I'm honored to be on with Val as an excellent moderator and these two experts. I think there's nothing more important than the ocean. I think so much of our livelihood depends on this and in our health and well-being. So I encourage everybody to really think about what they can be doing to preserve the ocean. Come down here and enjoy it. When I mentioned that we do, 7,000 students a year, probably at least 50% of the youth that may live only 15 to 20 miles away have never been down to the water's edge. And probably less than 10% of those, of all of them that we serve, have ever been out on the water. It's a beautiful, awesome California resource that people should really be enjoying. I think AltaSea's got some great programs. The Cabrillo Aquarium is an awesome way to introduce youth to what's going on in the oceans and the creatures that are there. So I think what an awesome discussion to be able to have on Earth Day, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Meredith, your thoughts? I think you're muted. There you go.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Val. This has been a wonderful conversation, and Bruce and Julie, it's been a real honor to speak on this panel with you. And also, just on behalf of AltaSea, wearing my AltaSea hat, thank you, for your partnership from LAMI and from Cabrillo. You're two of our most essential educational partners, and we encourage anybody watching today to go and visit their programs and see what they've got going on, because it's pretty amazing. And I just would like to close with bringing it back to Earth Day and what we can really do. There's a lot that we can do to support MPAs. You could take part in beach cleanups. You can reduce your plastics. You can eat sustainable seafood. The Monterey Bay Aquarium has a seafood source little card and also an app I believe they have now, and you can check and see if this the seafood that you're eating comes from a sustainable fishery or a sustainable farm. And just get involved, and number one, respect the ocean, and it will give you treasures unimaginable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Meredith. Dr. Passarelli, your final thoughts.
Well, I'll reiterate, thank you to Val and Meredith and Bruce. It's been awesome being on this webinar with you guys, and thank you to AltaSea for hosting. I'll just conclude and maybe bring us back to MPAs. I would encourage everybody to go to an MPA. Don't be afraid of MPAs. There's something for us to value and be proud that our state has MPAs. And I always like to think, and I tell everybody, do you like to go to, have you ever been to Yosemite? Have you ever been to Joshua Tree? Those are beautiful places. And you go there to feel one with nature and see animal life and appreciate our planet. And that's what MPAs are for as well. If it's some place, if you want to go into the intertidal, or you want to go snorkeling or diving, if you're certified, the best place is to go to an MPA, because that's where you're going to see the most animal life and the most beauty. But it's really important that you follow the rules while you're there. Look for the signs that are posted, or look on the California Department of Fish and Wildlife website first, and make sure that you know exactly what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in these different MPAs. But I will say, make sure you know where they are and go to them. They were put in place for us. It's our ocean. And thank you, Bruce, for bringing up the aquarium. Yes, we are a regional aquarium. We focus on marine life of Southern California. So if you come visit us, you'll see lots of different marine life that lives exclusively in Southern California. So you learn what's right in our backyard. But unfortunately, we are still closed. We are hoping to open up soon, but you can visit our website at Cabrillo Marine Aquarium for opening information.
Thank you. We will watch for that. Thank you so much. You guys were so wonderful. We learned so much, and you kept it all accessible. And I just want to remind everybody that there is a recording of this webinar. It will be posted on the altasea.org website. You can share it with others, or if you missed any of it or you want to watch it again, and it's there for you as a resource. We also want to say there are more webinars coming up. We are going to do one on aquaculture. We're going to get more into that. So that'll be coming up. Don't have a date yet, but sign up for the altasea.org. I'm sure they have an email or newsletter, and keep in touch. So thank you all for being here. Bruce, Meredith, Julie, you guys were terrific. What a wonderful day to recognize Earth Day. I learned a lot, including about fish and how they reproduce later in life, and that all makes sense. And it just goes to show you how important it is that we really treasure and preserve the gorgeous nature around us. So thank you again for being with us, and we look forward to having our audience join us again for future webinars at AltaSea. Happy Earth Day, everybody. Take care.
Happy Earth Day.